Good morning. Welcome to this joint overview and scrutiny committee meeting. I first of all remind you of some of the domestic arrangements. Toilets are situated outside the meeting room opposite the stairs. Cold water is also available in the breakout area outside the meeting room. If the fire alarm should sound, please leave the meeting room by following the fire exit signs and meet on the Ipswich Town Football Club training pitch. Please do not use the atrium stairs to exit the building. Do not re-enter the building until you are told it is safe to do so. Please switch off all mobile phones or turn them to silent. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. The whole of the meeting will be filmed, except where there are confidential or exempt items. If you make a representation to the meeting, you will be deemed by the Council to have consented to being filmed. By entering this room, you are also consenting to being filmed by the Council and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and/or training purposes. The Council, members of the public and the press may record, film, photograph or broadcast this meeting when the public and the press are not lawfully excluded. Finally, can members and officers please ensure that you press the microphone for speaking and turn it off when you are finished. Thank you. So on to item 1, apologies and substitutes.
None received, Chair.
Thank you. Do we have any declarations of interests? No. Okay, item 3. These are the minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of January 2020. We had 2 meetings on that day. This meeting is the meeting about the corporate plan outputs, agenda item 3. So, do we have any requests for amendments? Shall we go page 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? Thank you, Councillor Scarf.
Thank you, Chair. Page 9, 51.19, it says, I queried the environment outputs in relation to car parking in Stowmarket and asked for further details. That's not quite what I asked. I noted within the corporate outputs there was a review of car parking within Babergh, and my query related to whether a review for Stowmarket could be considered, looking at, in particular at exits and entrances, and in particular Milton Road car park. So if that helps to clarify the minutes.
Thank you, we can do that.
Thank you.
With that amendment, is everyone happy that I should sign these minutes as a true record? Yes, we have a proposal of the seconder, Councillor Osborne, Councillor Muller, and all were in favour, I believe. Thank you very much. Right, we now go on to another of the meetings held on that same day. This is the meeting to consider the Western Suffolk Community Safety Partnership. So are there any requests for amendments on page 13? We have 1 or 2 amendments here listed which we'll go through at the end. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 and 20. The office has got some amendments that have been sent in by email.
Yes, Chair, thank you. So I'm just going to read through the amendments. So 5.19 changed to relatively. 5.23 involved in 17 to 20 cases. 5.28 Councillor Haddingham had experienced abroad. 5.31, but with the support of the head teachers there was a growing and we had to remove had helped. 5.32 add as indicated by recent press reports. 5.37 to add once mental health issues or abuse had been established appeared to be a problem, finding a solution to this was important. And 5.38 to add in between, I think, he and the council. If that makes sense to everyone. I can say that the published minutes and the signed minutes all include these amendments.
So with those amendments, can I have a proposer and a seconder? Thank you. Councillor Muller, Councillor Hanningham. And is everyone in favour of approving the minutes? Yes, thank you very much. So we're on to item 5, any notification of petitions.
None received.
Thank you. Questions by the public.
None received.
Questions by councillors.
None received, Chair.
Thank you. So we go on to the main item on the agenda, which is to consider the planning enforcement report JOS 1925. We have 3 officers, well 4 officers now. Tom Barker, Phil Isbell, Simon Bailey and Julie Havard are here. I think Phil's going to give a presentation first. Can I say that I found this an excellent report, and it gives us a very clear introduction into how planning enforcement has been managed in the recent past, changes that have recently been implemented, and a recommendation for next steps. So if you are content, we'll listen to Phil's presentation, and then we'll take questions for the officers before we go into debate. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, members. So there are 2 recommendations before you, but perhaps before we touch on those, it's appropriate just to headline some of the important context to this report. I think the most useful thing I can start with is draw your attention to the advice of the NPPF in paragraph 9.7, which fairly simply and succinctly describes in paragraph 58 of the NPPF how we are expected to apply enforcement as an activity. It reminds authorities that enforcement action is discretionary, so it is a choice, and that it requires proportionate responses. It is something where one must measure and take a balanced approach to the enforcement investigation that you undertake, and it describes the value and importance of having a local enforcement plan, which the government expects to set out how councils propose to monitor, investigate and take action where appropriate. So in headline terms, the expectation is that all councils will have a local enforcement plan which describes how we do enforcement and what we do, and sets out some standards. And it's fair to say that there are all shades of how enforcement plans are undertaken. Ours is included in a link or with the papers as Appendix A. Just so to put some context to this, in our current local enforcement plan, paragraph 6.4, we talk about 3 priorities of enforcement investigation: high priority cases, medium priority and low priority cases. And the significance of that is then played out in paragraph 7.3, which describes the timetable that we set for ourselves in visiting sites in each of those categories. And effectively, the cases which are of greatest potential concern and most urgent are high priority cases, which we say we will visit within 3 working days. And then we talk to the medium and low priority cases as being matters we will investigate on site within 5 and 15 days respectively. Now that's a fairly standard approach to most local enforcement policies, if you can call them that, to categorise harm and to approach it in a way which describes the priority that you give to attending on site. We also, in paragraph 7.2, confirm that we'll acknowledge receipt of any request to investigate something within 3 working days. So those are effectively the starting points for any investigation. And from our perspective, the question of where an investigation then goes becomes a matter of what is proportionate, what is balanced, and what information do you need in order to successfully follow an investigation to its conclusion. It is not unlawful to break planning law. That was something that was considered by the government back in the 1990s and shied away from. And I think it's fair to say it remains a source of some tension with those who are receiving what they perceive as harm arising from a breach of planning control. The breach of planning control if investigated to its logical conclusion, will either conclude that one might grant planning permission anyway and an investigation is not successfully pursued simply for the sake of inviting a planning application where that would achieve nothing. But there are other alternative mechanisms available to the authority to remedy matters which cause harm. They include an enforcement notice, they include breach of condition notice, and they include the potential to ultimately go to court and seek an injunction where matters are not satisfactorily resolved. And if you look in your papers, one of the case studies concerning a change of use shows the timeline of critical actions from investigation through to an injunction. And as you'll see, I think that case involves some 5 years worth of time taken to go through that process. It's fair to say that enforcement is not a swift process, but it has to be done in a balanced and measured way because it does affect people's rights to use land, and it is therefore an important thing. There are other approaches to describing how you investigate harm, and we're aware that various other councils have done this in other ways, both describing harm, complexity and urgency, and the recommendation that you have before you is effectively to establish a member officer task and finish group to look at the joint local planning enforcement plan and to review it, having regard to best practice elsewhere. The current plan has been in place for some time. It's appropriate to do that, and I think having taken on responsibility for the enforcement team, now is a good time to look elsewhere at other examples of good practice and to look at what our communities need from enforcement investigations and reports in order that we have a plan that can both give those investigated and communities some confidence as to the process that the council will follow. In recommendation 3.3, we also advise we update you on service transformation work. It is fair to say that we are in an ongoing process of transforming how we work and how we use the software that we have available. We use the same uniform software in enforcement that the development management team have access to, and we have built up experience in development management about the effective use of that to manage caseloads and support officers as they manage their cases through from commencement of an investigation through to a conclusion. Now, the first point to raise there is that we have recently, in January, actually been through an exercise of data cleansing with old records from Accolade, which are now translated into uniform. That's a recent piece of work, and that enables officers to get a better handle on the planning history of land and is an important point of their investigation in order to understand what may or may not have happened in the past with any particular parcel of land. So that work was undertaken from the middle of January through to the end, and I think it's fair to say we were comfortable with the work that was done by iDocs, the software provider, to assist us with that package, and that's now in place. We concurrently have, nevertheless, a large number of investigations to conclude. I think at the moment they stand at about 280 investigations, which I think, in fairness, is now at a level which is lower than it's probably been for some considerable time. And I've asked the team to focus on closing the oldest of cases as an exercise of reviewing what's in that workload and what is truly necessary for investigation and what the appropriate steps are to take such an investigation forward. There's various other pieces of information in the report that go behind what you have. There's reference to the total number of planning investigations that were undertaken in 2019 based on a calendar year, and they amount to somewhat over 500 investigations, of which I've subsequently broken down into a table the breaches of condition that have been investigated through 2019. It's fair to say, coming here, that committee wish to understand a little about the investigation of conditions issue, and I think we've endeavoured to do that and to summarise how that relates to the building control regime. There is, as I think is described at 422 of your report, a perception quite widely held that approved inspectors working in the building control area may be less wedded to planning regulation and less in dialogue with enforcement issues, and therefore those cases are, as a matter of perception, sometimes the subject of concern. I don't think that's borne out by evidence that I can put here today, Chairman, in fairness. Certainly I've come across cases which have involved approved inspectors, but equally I've come across cases which have involved building control regulated matters. So at the moment I don't have evidence that indicates there's a particular problem around that, although I am aware that there is certainly a perception of that being the case. As regards Suffolk County Council's conditions, they, amongst other stakeholders, recommend conditions to us. We, as planning authority, have the responsibility for enforcing those, and we will usually write conditions where we have taken the suggested language and text from Suffolk County Council and made sure it's fit for purpose for investigation. Ultimately, we would, in the course of investigating anything which is a Suffolk County Council related condition, look to ensure that we're working in harmony, so that were we to need to serve an enforcement notice, the County Council are in a position to support us with that formality of action. And obviously the significance of that comes when one receives an appeal and one has to defend an appeal against an enforcement notice. There are a number of grounds that any person receiving an enforcement notice may appeal against. Those are not described in your papers. They are a matter which is potentially a risk in any particular enforcement investigation, and to that extent it's something I can talk to, Chairman, but in terms of our own process, we must work with what Planning Inspectorate have made available to us and what statute allows, and there are a number of grounds upon which one may appeal any notice, including the fact that the matter may not be a breach of planning control, that the time allowed to remedy that breach may not be long enough, or that the people served with the notice are not the right people. In simple terms, getting to the point of serving an enforcement notice is a heavy and onerous responsibility. It is a matter which is of significant consequence because it affects the land at all times after the notice comes into effect, and to that extent one as an authority needs to get that right before serving a notice, and therefore my usual preference is that in deciding the question of expediency, that the principle of act in haste, repent at leisure applies. It is appropriate to get one's investigation correct and to have one's allegations correctly documented before one launches formal action, lest one be found wanting by either an inspector or the courts. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Have members any questions of Phil or any of the officers on the report and his presentation? Councillor McLaren.
Phil, I was really interested in the paper. I think it's brilliant. I just, as a matter of interest, want to know, you said about enforcement, its impact was effectiveness and reputational. Is there evidence that there are other local authorities that have opted not to undertake enforcement?
Chairman, I'm not aware of any local authorities that have actually undertaken not to take enforcement. I think my experience over a number of years in planning is that, albeit it is a discretionary service, it is a matter which is important in communities. I think most authorities wrestle with the issue that it is, to a degree, not a service that brings in income, but is nevertheless very important locally. And I think in terms of transformation of this service, what we as officers can give you as members is more information about where we are in the process. I think it's fair to say we would be unwilling to tell you everything about the particular point an investigation might be at, because it may be very sensitive, and in fairness, where one has an investigation that may become a criminal matter, one must be careful with it. But there are certainly quite a lot of information points along the way which would help. And I think if one takes examples in both Babergh and Mid-Suffolk, one can certainly say that community confidence is bolstered by having an enforcement team that investigates in an appropriate way. And you can see where investigations are not undertaken satisfactorily. They are the sort of meat and drink of national newspaper stories.
Thank you. The number, Phil, of total number of investigations into alleged breaches is high, but what you actually then sort of do with them is, you know, like I said, doesn't come up to that figure. So does that mean that most of them are just alleged and they aren't actually founded?
It's fair to say, as a summary, the number of cases that lead to an enforcement notice being served and formality are small in comparison to the totality. You will usually, within a fairly swift time of your site visit, conclude that a lot of cases are either not a breach or it is not expedient to enforce. I don't have the numbers available to hand, and part of what I need to do from here through the rest of the spring is to ensure I can measure just what is falling out of the system at what point, because with high, medium and low priorities, you know, we don't at the present have a record in the software which describes, you know, what the proportion of those cases that are closed and for what reason, and that's information I want to be able to capture and report back. So in essence, a lot of cases will be closed relatively quickly. What tends to happen is that the difficult cases drag, and they may drag because you struggle to find the information. You then need legal advice, and then you may launch onto a more formal process of investigating and serving a planning contravention notice to get information. And certainly the most efficient enforcement teams use a good blend of action with encouraging cooperation. Because it is usually more effective for the authority and its resources to encourage somebody to comply with a notice than to simply serve a notice. One could probably increase the number of notices fairly rapidly, but you might well achieve the same result by polite persuasion, the carrot and stick approach, if I may put it like that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sorry, did you have a follow-up? Councillor Mellon.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I've had some experience of enforcement as a parish councillor over several years, and actually had some enforcement action on myself about a decade ago with a visit and a regularisation of something I was doing. My perception of it as a parish councillor is that the council's been reluctant to take action, and understand, you know, what you've set out in terms of the steps you want to take before that happens. But with some individuals, there's obviously a kind of persistent pattern of behaviour that builds up that seems to a parish councillor that it would require some action, which seems to take a long while to happen. Is that reluctance or seeming reluctance to take action because there's a limit to resources and there's a cost to going down the legal route?
In very general terms, I think there is partly a question of experience and knowledge, and experienced and well-qualified enforcement officers are not awash in the country. So much like planners, there is a bit of a shortage, and you need therefore to use your resources wisely. I think this is probably more about perception, because if you can't see what's going on, you probably assume nothing is happening, and that's rarely the case. In reality, there are sometimes difficult decisions and sometimes questions which get to the heart of whether something is or is not a breach, or whether one particular enforcement tool or another is the right way of doing something. Everything has risks, for instance. And to that extent, the nature of the breach you're looking at usually drives the complexity. From my point of view, the case study about the change of use that you have is of no surprise to me, given the nature of the breach involved. You know, that pattern of time taken and involvement, I imagine as a parish councillor watching that, will be extremely disheartening and cause you to lose confidence. And I've certainly seen enough situations where parish councils have a somewhat black and white view of these things, but enforcement investigations are very rarely black and white. And this gets back to the point that the NPPF encourages, which is about proportionate approaches. So I think it's fair to say that there's always a value in having experienced staff. I think Simon's team are gaining experience as they go, and I think that with the right use of the software behind them to performance manage cases, we can probably better inform parish councils and councillors what's going on, which I think has value. Now, in terms of resources, I'm not convinced at this stage that I can actually answer your question one way or the other, for the simple reason that I'm in a process of looking at where the workload is and understanding how the workflow is through from start to finish for the investigations we have on, and I wouldn't feel comfortable recommending to you that it is something that the council spends money on, or that it concludes it does not need to resource. We have an additional resource in one officer with a specific focus on some cases, but it's true to say the most complex cases come back to the team leader in Simon Bailey to follow up, and then you're on hostage to the courts sometimes for dates, planning inspectorate for dates, and I think there is a considerable lag in getting appeal dates out of them, none of which speaks to our resources. So there is a question of our effectiveness in what we do with our resources, and that's something which, from my perspective, I haven't concluded. I suspect we could be more efficient in how we use the resources and staff that we have, and better use the software to optimise the way we investigate cases, but it will always come to a point where somebody needs to have confidence to make a decision, and you can sometimes find cases become stuck when somebody is lacking in confidence about whether they should take a course A or course B. So if I may sit on the fence with that resource question, that's possibly where I would go with it.
Thank you. Tom Barker, you'd like to say a few words?
Yes, if I can just perhaps add some comfort, I guess. I have never, as Assistant Director, said to one of the officers, don't take this action because it will either be too expensive or too resource intensive. So that has never been a conversation that we've had. So if there's a perception of that out there, we do need to address that, because it hasn't been something that I've ever said as Assistant Director.
Thank you, Tom. I've got Councillor Haddingham and then Councillor Grandon, please.
Thank you. Just something you said about building inspectors. Were you saying they were sort of more likely to come to you or less likely? And is that something that you think, if it was an in-house service, that we could make, possibly not make money from, but like I say, would be able to charge for their services rather than it being outsourced?
I tend to take a view that if you're dealing with something such as a breach of condition, we as a council have a role in helping to support delivery, and actually there are some things that we can do and should try to do which are more effective about supporting delivery. If somebody hasn't breached a condition, we should try and get them to that point where they have. So it might be an enforcement investigation, but actually if we picked things up earlier and were a little bit more inquisitive, which I think we can do, then that bolts onto the work that building control may be doing as part of their work. Building control are always, to a degree, in tension because they have to compete with the market. So, to some degree, they are not our policemen on the ground. But there is a good level of dialogue between officers. They do discuss issues and options, and they are quite effective at working with builders on the ground to guide them to the right officer to talk to, how to steer these things. I don't think it's something that you can charge for. I think it's about value added, and I think in terms of that value added, the important point for the market is in working with building control, you're likely to have a more straightforward process rather than if you use an improving inspector. You may well find that if things do become an investigation, you're dealing with things that you weren't expecting to. So I think my perception of that is the role of building control will not alter what enforcement officers do, but between development management, between building control and enforcement, that question of delivery and helping people get it right with their conditions is definitely something that adds value to what we do and adds to the role of the council in promoting growth.
Thank you. Councillor Grandon.
Thank you, Chair. My question is regarding retrospective planning applications. I can see that that's a remedy that becomes a necessary tool. But I wondered if, I'm not sure how it works, so perhaps you could explain, because I can see that for some developers, it might be just a useful way to kind of get round the system. And I wondered whether the enforcement process includes a kind of deterrent to certainly repeat actions of this nature from the same developer who finds this a way that he might get the approval through a backdoor system, if you like. And I wondered if there's any sort of deterrent built into the enforcement process so that a developer, even a small developer, doesn't use this as an ongoing way of acting.
Thank you, Chairman. The opportunity does not so much exist within the enforcement process as it exists within the planning process, and certainly Babergh District Council and Mid-Suffolk District Council have used the power to decline to determine retrospective applications where you might call them, perhaps vexatious is too strong a word, but mischievous for sure. And certainly I'm aware of sites where we've had a line of applications by somebody looking to prolong a process. Effectively, where you've had a previous application which has been determined and gone to appeal, there is an opportunity under the statutes to decline to determine a follow-on application for something of the same nature or character within, I think it's 12 months. Doubtless Simon can correct me on the specifics. I'm not sure they're the important point here today. There is a value there to taking a line with those people who clearly have a pattern of trying to avoid action by making applications. And from our perspective, when we look at matters that might be the subject of a retrospective application, which is part and parcel of almost every enforcement investigation, the enforcement officer will speak to the planning officer about the prospects for that as an application, whether or not that should then feed into our pre-application process, or whether or not that would be a lost cause and what action we should take. It nevertheless remains that an applicant can make an application based on their own sound judgment and advice, and none of that necessarily debars us taking enforcement action. My usual instinct is if one has one application in process, one would not serve a notice while one is waiting to see that determined, but if the breach is so significant and the harm so significant, you would not rule that out. It is very much a question of judgment in a particular case, but in most normal cases, one would allow the application process to play out through committee if necessary. Follow an application for something of the same character or description, I would be surprised to see if there was a very clear steer that that wasn't acceptable. If that application came in, that would not necessarily deter me from concluding enforcement was expedient. None of that stops an applicant from making that sort of application, and they might well then seek to try and argue their case in front of a planning inspector. But there are mechanisms available to us. They don't necessarily exist within planning enforcement per se, but within the planning team, we do have tools to discourage mischievous applications which seek to prevent the evil day, if I may say, of the council actually seeking compliance and remedying a breach. They are not used frequently, but they are available to us and we do use them.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, sorry, yes, Councillor McCraw.
Thank you, Chair. I note in the report at a variety of places we have a number of performance measures, usually measured in days, as to how many days it will take us to do this, that or the other. I just wondered, do we measure those performances, and have we got some results from those?
That's a work in progress, in fairness, Councillor McGraw. We do measure and can measure the site visit performance against the high, medium and low priority target set within the policy, but that tells you nothing about the ongoing investigation. From my perspective, the worth and the value in reviewing the plan is that one can then look in detail at, for each of those priorities, what one might reasonably expect. There will always be variations, no case is the same, and one will always find a reason why something may be outside of the usual parameters. But for most investigations, I think we should be able to set those measures. At the moment, they don't exist. The data in a clean format has only really existed since the end of January. Prior to that, there was a large volume of applications in the data, which meant that running any kind of management report to describe measures would have contained a lot of irrelevant historic data. You will now, as you're probably obviously aware from your own inboxes, now be receiving a report on cases that are being opened and cases that are being closed. I have a report on cases that are live and open, but I want to get that into a clean form and to provide meaningful information within that to you before I share it with all members, because otherwise it will simply tell you, we have an enforcement investigation in relation to this site, it's live. I think from my perspective, if I were a member, what I would want to see is what's happening with that within the little and where it is in the process. And those measures, Julie, Simon, John Wolsey and my team are looking at, and we are developing them. We are presently looking actively at dealing with the oldest of cases, and from my perspective, I've approached this on the basis of those cases which are older than 26 weeks, and there are a number of those, and looking to get those to the next to the substantive action point next in line, so the team are focused on that. If you look on the website, you will see that we have published a note which says that we are looking at how we transform the service, and to that extent we ask people to be to manage their own expectations, shall we say. So I can't strictly give you much in the way of performance information yet.
Can I just continue on this point? It's not actually, it's an observation, because this is largely not my own personal experience. This is what has been reported to me by other members and members of the public, and it's also a perception, I believe, and that it is historical. As I say, my recent experience has been merely in reporting a possible concern about something that's been immediately taken on as an active case, and I've been sent an email saying, your active case such and such. I didn't even know I had an active case. So in that instance, as overperformance, there is a definite improvement, I think, and I hope to see that continue. But I think this report is a very good step in that direction. I'll come back to that in recommendations.
Councillor Grant. Oh, sorry, Tom Barker's got something to come back.
So I just wanted to, through you, Chair, I just wanted to add to what Phil was describing there, just to, in terms of the number of days and what is reasonable and how should we do things. The application process contains a number of those things within regulation. So an application will be received, you will do 21 days consultation with people, you will process a minor application within 8 weeks, you will process a major application within 13 weeks or 16 weeks, and the government has its planning guarantee that if we take more than 26 weeks, then we should be refunding a fee. So there are some parameters within the planning application process that don't exist within the enforcement process. And one of the things that Phil, Simon, Julie and the team are looking at is actually, do those timescales that the application process gives us provide something that we could look to mirror in terms of enforcement? So what is it that we should or could be looking to do within 8 weeks? What is it that we should be looking to do within 13 or 16 weeks? And I think that's why Phil referred earlier to 26 weeks. Well, why 26 weeks and not 25 weeks or 30 weeks or 35 weeks? Borrowing from some of the time periods that exist within the planning system as it currently exists just seems reasonable, and so that is starting to inform how we look at complexity and the various different stages within the process, and that's something that your plan, in due course, when the Task and Finish group look at it, can seek to put those kind of expectations in.
Could I, if I can add to that, I think Tom adding to what I said, I don't know, I didn't go myself, but colleagues, as part of a development management review of our workload, visited Milton Keynes a few months ago, and were fortunate enough to get a bit of a briefing on how their enforcement plan works. And I don't know, Julie, is it worthwhile you adding anything to what we saw there and where that might take us with our review? If you could do that.
So, yeah, we went to Milton Keynes based on their working on the planning side of things, but part of that visit included some information about enforcement. They originally had about 1,000 cases, which they'd reduced to about 200 or 300 over a period of time. They have a scoring chart for assessment of harm, so they basically score every report as it comes in as to whether there is harm or not. We have sort of looked at that as an option, but it's basically rating every report for instance, is there any highway safety, is there any what is the age of the breach, so has it been going on for a long time, has somebody only just noticed, is it worth investigation, is it worth taking up and asking whether they need to put an application in, will that application be supported, or are we just asking them to put an application in eventually will be refused, so actually are we wasting time dragging the process out? Is it something that affects other people, or is it something that just affects the person living on the site? Is there neighbours around it? So there is options on where we go next, and Milton Keynes had been quite proactive at reducing the caseload and coming back to people and keeping people informed. There is also other options of providing enforcement information online, which we are looking at as well. But obviously, because of the confidentiality of the complainant, it's how we keep people informed. But obviously, on balance, is we don't want to give too much away as in respect of who's actually made the complaint in the first place. So trying to keep that neutral.
Thank you. Councillor McGraw again.
Yes, okay. Didn't have to say it again in quite that tone of voice, Chair. Quite understandable, I do appreciate it. I just thought it would be useful, and I wanted to look at the case studies a little bit, if that was possible. But that's what they've been supplied for, after all. And I'll do the last one first, if I may, because for the life of me, I wasn't entirely certain as to what the breach of condition in the first case had been. And the before and after photographs left me none the wiser. It was fairly obvious with the hedge. I could see that one, but I couldn't quite see. I mean, please put a blue Range Rover here. I don't know if that was the breach, but I just wondered if you could describe what the nature of that case was.
Thank you, Councillor McGraw. It was to do with landscaping. So in front of the vehicle in the photograph, you can see a number of spirals, plastic spirals, which would contain the hedge planting that was required by the Planning Commission.
That was a planning condition. Yeah. Oh, fine. That's super. Thanks very much. Just wasn't certain. Second one was, well, the lengthy case, the 5.5-year one referred to earlier by Phil there, and that looks a very contentious matter. I mean, that goes through 8 appeals and involves contempt hearings on 2 occasions. Now, I'm guessing that's a former caravan site or a mobile homes site that was being used improperly. Now, those are not uncommon in Babergh and Mid-Suffolk. We all have heard of cases in both areas. I just wondered if you could give us some pointers on that type of issue. It's a very contentious one, and I think it's something that we can expect to see again.
That particular case started out as a report about a fence and grew into unauthorised use of land for stationing of caravans used for residential purposes. As it turned out, the people that were using it were Gypsy and Traveller heritage, but they were looking to settle on that piece of land. They bought it. They wanted to use it for living on. But the principal issue that we'd had as a problem with that was a highway safety issue in relation to the access, because of the land's proximity to various highway issues, Humpback Bridge and a fairly significant bend in the road. So whilst they applied, those applications were refused. They made 8 applications in the end for various different things. Some of those applications came after we'd served the enforcement notice, so we declined to determine those. And after non-compliance with the enforcement notice and subsequent prosecution and further non-compliance, we then went down the route of obtaining an injunction. which they didn't comply with, so we took them back to court a further 2 times on contempt, and that ultimately resulted with a threat of prison time to them leaving the site.
So quite a particular set of circumstances,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
probably not typical of the sort of cases that would normally come towards planning enforcement, one would hope.
I wouldn't describe them as typical. No, that one's unusual. It's not. They're rare, but they do happen. We have a number of cases ongoing where the person that is responsible for the breach persists, despite our best efforts to advise them otherwise. There's probably 5 or 6 that are of a length which is, largely unacceptable and similar in this case, 5+ years to try and get something resolved, and using all the options available to us in order to achieve the desired outcome.
Can I follow on, Chair? It's
do,
just
yes.
while I'm doing this on cases and general approach, because one of the biggest concerns in planning enforcement for members, I think, and for residents across the 2 districts is we have a lot of large planning applications with multiple planning conditions applied to them, and any planning enforcement regime needs to carry the confidence of the public that planning conditions will be enforced, and also, but also the time scale over which these processes take place. Now, I know from my own observation that it is often a lot of time spent just persuading people, but I wonder if the officers could describe the approach they take with many of the larger applications that we both face, where we're talking about, I don't know, 20, 30 or 40 even, maybe 40 is a bit much, different planning conditions that may be subject to, sort of slightly different sorts of interpretation by the developer as opposed to ourselves. That was a bit vague, but I'm just wondering the general approach.
If I lead, and Simon can correct me when I go wrong, the first and foremost point is for the larger sites, we try and make sure we've got an effective relationship with the builder so that we have a line of communication with them. Usually with the larger sites, they're not isolated cases, and there's normally a sensible dialogue about those breaches when they're brought to our attention or we become aware of them from other reasons. And typically one then encounters some internal communication problems sometimes in some of those businesses, which mean that those on site aren't necessarily reading the same piece of paper that they should be. The first and foremost approach is obviously to try and encourage compliance within a reasonable period of time, and it depends on what that condition is. If somebody has started groundworks and you've got an archaeological condition to discharge, well, that's something for immediate action, because otherwise you will damage the remains that are in situ. If you've got something going on to a series of trees, as I'm aware of a relatively recent investigation is involving, and then you have a conversation about the discharge of that condition, if there is a condition involved, and where the planning team are with their approach to that, good or bad, on planning merit. So there's quite close conversation between those 2 teams to work out what action is the important point next. It's very hard to generalise about this. I think it is important that we understand and take a more effective view around how we deal with conditions, and that's not just about enforcing them, but actually helping people to discharge them. They are quite onerous even for small developments to navigate successfully, and a failure to do that properly can, if you play the worst case scenario, has led to some large companies being exposed to a high sill bill because they've failed to discharge their conditions at the right timing. So these are not matters that are light and are quite significant for the building industry, and I think they're only slowly waking up to that risk. Not quite sure what comfort I can put around that other than say I think it's certainly on our radar as an important thing to get right across the team. One typically finds that the question of construction management is a problem. The white van man turning up too early, the delivery lorry parking outside a site, etc. Some of those things then become a problem because they occur within the highway, say, and therefore we wouldn't normally have scope to enforce them, and we will try and encourage good behaviour where we can, but we try and use what tools are available, and to a degree that's the cost-effective approach rather than to approach matters with an enforcement notice. As a general point around enforcement investigations of all natures, Simon, Julie and I have discussed the opportunity to use more planning contravention notices as a tool to encourage behaviour. Now, planning contravention notice is effectively a formal question asked of somebody, which requires a response, I believe, within 21 days, or is actually an offence not to respond. And my experience has been that they are a way of getting someone's undivided attention. You don't always get the answer you're expecting, you don't always get the answer that you want, because sometimes people need a second or third notice served upon them, and certainly in my time I've come across people who really didn't like being asked questions because they felt they didn't want to answer them. But they are a way of ensuring people are focused that they have a problem to solve. Now, I think when it comes to breach of condition issues, if we use our administration team more effectively, we can probably give the officers some background support and indeed do that around wasteland notices and other matters. I think there are opportunities there for our support team to be more effectively engaged in supporting their officers to do some of the work that puts the officers in a good position with information, and along the way also encourages the right behaviours.
Councillor Caston. Sorry, Simon would like to just add to that.
Sorry, apologies. Just to finish off the point you were making and add to the comments from Phil, none of those cases that we've got that have gone on for lots of years involve large-scale developments or large-scale developers. They will all be individuals. And some of that is that they just don't want to engage with the process, and some of that is they just don't understand the process. We do get reports of breaches of condition by large-scale developers, but they're relatively quick and straightforward to resolve because those developers have got a reputation to uphold, they've got shareholders, they've got goodwill that they need to maintain. Yeah, most of those would have come about because they've either forgotten to discharge that condition or it's in the process of them doing something. So, we might get a report that a condition is being breached because there's activity on site, and what they're actually doing is trying to discharge the condition, the archaeology, for example, or something like that. So we'll go and do a site visit, establish that to be the case, and then report back on that. And most of the time that would be a case closed because there is no breach. Okay.
Councillor Caston.
Right. Thank you. So at the end of last week in Brantford, the Feiston site, we had some emergency enforcement. A building was dangerous and we had the storm coming, and everything seemed to happen very quickly. The building was taken down, and the danger to the public that building presented was dealt with very quickly, and that was great, and I was really pleased about that. But with our priority list of high, low and medium, where does that site sit in there where there's no activity so much going on at the site, there's no unauthorised building or anything, but it does pose potentially a danger to the public. Where would that be in our priority list, please?
Chairman, I'm guided that's medium, is it?
Yes.
That case? That's a medium case. I mean, obviously, as what was, one of the biggest listed building in Suffolk, it might well have been a high priority case, but much of that interest having been burnt, that alters the perspective on that. I think, in part, the answer to this question is that a high, medium and low approach to a policy is too simplistic, and it doesn't actually helpfully give everybody confidence about what steps happen next. So that case of itself, I believe the action involved was a building control dangerous structure action, not planning enforcement. And obviously, you know, that's a life and limb exercise. I think from our point of view, the site itself, if it's stable, it is, you know, a medium priority case rather than a high priority case. But that does not actually tell anybody anything about how our involvement with that site, because it is, you know, multidisciplinary, how our involvement goes forward from here. And I think a review of the policy, a review of the plan, would allow us to describe it somewhat, perhaps in the way that Julie was describing in relation to Milton Keynes's approach, which is to look beyond simple priority into complexity and to harm. Because as Simon was saying in relation to breach of condition cases, you know, there is a question of what's urgent and what's complex, and you know, breach of condition cases can sometimes be straightforward, they can sometimes be complicated, and if you know as a member of the public that something is being treated as a complex issue, it gives you more understanding that it may not happen overnight and that there will be, you know, time necessary to get that investigation right.
Thank you. I've got a couple of queries. You've spoken about degree of harm, you've spoken about urgency, and there's also coming into play the possibility of reinstatement. So if I can look at two scenarios. One is a mature line of trees which have a TPO on them. Somebody's come along with a chainsaw and started to cut them down. We look at the degree of harm, the urgency, and the possibility of reinstatement. I'm not sure where that would be on the list of priorities. But there's also a look again now at a building being constructed on a piece of land where there's no planning application whatsoever. There could be a degree of harm there, but there's always the possibility of reinstatement because you could knock it down and plough it up and plant grass or whatever. In either of those cases, do you have the power to stop what's going on?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, for TPO cases, it would register with us as a high priority, and we aim to get somebody out the same day or the next day. Unauthorised works to a TPO are a criminal offence, strict liability offence. So once we could caution the people on site if we see somebody on site and advise them that they're committing an offence and they need to stop. And we could then proceed with, we could take them to court straight away as soon as possible. We could speak to legal about getting them into court as soon as possible. That might not necessarily stop them from cutting down the trees, but we could then require them to reinstate the trees with something of a similar size or species, I think is what the legislation says. So if it's, you know, a line of 10 mature oaks, they would be expected to replace them with a line of 10 mature oaks. Whether or not the courts would actually be able to achieve that, I'm not sure, because we've never had that experience. But that's what the legislation says. In relation to a building, you were talking about conversion of a building? Or a new build?
We've got a paddock. Somebody has decided to start constructing a large building on it. The locals all know that there's going to be a big building on there because that's what the owner of the paddock has said. But they haven't put in any planning application. There's no indication that they wish to do so.
We would need to look at that in terms of the harm, and it's whether or not it would be acceptable in planning terms. If it was, then we could invite an application for its retention in order to regularise it. If it was considered by officers, enforcement and planning officers, to not be something we could support via the local plan, then we could tell them to stop. We could serve them with a temporary stop notice, which requires them to stop for 28 days. After that 28 days, we would then need to serve them with a notice if we wanted them to not continue.
Thank you. And I'm now thinking about a building. The person or the individual who's responsible for the alleged brief, if they were determined to carry on, is there ever a possibility that you might say, well, the only way to resolve this is, although it's unlikely they would get a planning permission, that they should put in an application just to clear the air? Would you ever suggest that to the person who's building?
I don't think we would ever encourage, Chairman, somebody to make an application which was unlikely on balance to succeed. Clearly, with the worst of breaches of enforcement, people often take their own advice and will nevertheless do that, and will work on the basis if they can buy themselves nothing, they'll buy themselves time by it. We have various tools in the toolbox, and ultimately we could seek injunctions in relation to some of these matters. We can serve an enforcement notice with immediate effect, but there are consequences and penalties if we take away people's usual rights to appeal. So the likelihood of us inviting an application would not be successful seems, it's certainly not something I would encourage the team to do. I am aware in the past some enforcement officers in former authorities have managed their caseloads down by encouraging applications, which then creates a problem with the planning team. But in broad terms, we work together much more effectively, and I think that is unlikely to happen as a principle. But it wouldn't stop somebody from making an application to buy time and or see whether they could win on appeal.
Thank you. Councillor McCraw.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow on from that, so as I understand it, and this is a point I wanted to come on to earlier actually, this is a non-criminal matter, but so basically we're dealing with civil law here, but the only people who can apply as any civil act is the planning enforcement team. It's not something that anybody else can undertake. But there are, and I want to stress this point, that there are penalties. There are financial penalties as well as reputational penalties. And that's a very important point I think this meeting should bring out. Although it's not criminal, and I must admit, I think we've all seen at various times, perhaps in various parts of social media, the word "that's criminal" used. It's not much good saying, no, I'm afraid it isn't criminal, but that is the case. But it does imply penalties. Now, the question as to what those penalties should be and whether they're sufficient is another matter. But so I think we've had some examples, so I just wanted to draw that out.
Thank you. But I think Simon said that working on cutting down trees with a TPO is a criminal offence. Yes. Yeah. There are some. So there are some exceptions.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if you look at the items, if you read through the policy, you'll see the items that are high priority include works to trees, works to listed buildings, which are a criminal offence. But generally speaking, breaching planning law is not. And I think there is a general expectation in the public's mind that it should be, and it isn't, and perhaps with good reason. And the plan and the policy is therefore, from my perspective, an important way of managing expectations so that everyone is comfortable that it is being done in a proportionate way, and that my experience with this is ultimately that people do get their comeuppance ultimately, and that what then becomes unsatisfactory for a period of time is an unavoidable consequence.
Just to add, Mr. Chair, the report does make the point that we are not in the business of penalising here. We are not trying to apply penalties. That would be a petty way to act, and the report makes that quite clear.
Councillor Mellon. Sorry, Councillor Osborne. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank the planning team and Simon Bailey for enforcement. I think this is a very, very good paper, and in terms of the joint enforcement, I think is excellent. And I was just wondering whether actually our bigger councils, parish or town, would benefit from having a copy of this to ensure that they know exactly what's going on. Just one question, Mr. Chairman, that is the 3 site visits undertaken, 3 site visits undertaken. 27 site visits. That is excellent. And can I just ask, how did these site visits come about? Was it because of the application, or was it because of residents or councillors actually coming forward with a situation where you've gone out to visit? I would just like to say, in my experience, I've had nothing but excellent responses from the enforcement team, and I can't fault anything they've done. But I'd just like to know that, in fact, is it because you're getting a lot of residents, or is it coming from the application itself?
So in the bundle you've got a draft workload report which lists out 27 site visits undertaken. That's a snapshot of workload in a week. So from my perspective, and this is a work in progress to give members information, that tells you that something is happening in relation to those cases. It doesn't tell you more than that, and I think that's simply in line with the policy. That is us visiting those sites, and we will have aimed to do that in accordance with the policy for each and every one. But as a piece of information, it then confirms that that action has happened. So it is a snapshot for our workload purposes. It is, I think, useful to you to see that, as is sometimes not obviously apparent, what officers are doing with their time, and to know and have confidence that something is happening with one investigation or another.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, Mr. Chairman. That, and I only hope that we get the site visits, because the perception from the public is that there are things going on which they're not agreeing with, and perhaps they are committing a breach of enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got Councillor Mellon and then Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I can echo that last comment, that I think if it's not already a public document, that it should be. It'd be very useful to have that out there for parish councils to look at. My question was, is enforcement purely reactive? I mean, obviously we have hundreds, perhaps thousands of development sites and lots of conditions on some of them. Is it only reacting to complaints, or is there any kind of proactive nature to it?
Chairman, the simple answer is it is generally speaking reactive, and we don't have the resource or expect to take a sort of proactive approach where others might provide that information, for instance. So with dialogue between the planning team and the enforcement team, if there are things that might become an issue, we will keep, colleagues will keep their fellow officers informed about issues that might be emerging. I'm not expecting that we take a more proactive approach to enforcement matters, because that could become, one would have to choose in which cases you would do that and under what circumstances to give the public confidence, and that could become quite something to write into a local enforcement plan, and arguably quite a resource drain if that was abortive work.
Thank you. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. I know it's early days in your development of your systems and team. When that is sort of established, do you see implementing some regular audit systems on how the department is functioning and achieving its objectives? Okay.
I think it's fair to say that's an appropriate activity to do once we've got to a position where we're comfortable we've got the process in place in the way we want it, and that we've got the right resource doing the work that we need to have done. So I see no reason why we wouldn't audit and review that in due course. My own instinct is that the work in progress that's being described here, I'm not expecting, and I always make reference to Springwatch being in May, I'm not expecting to have got to a point where I can really know best around resources and that process until we got to the middle of the year, and that then would lead us to look at how we're performing at the year end, I would suggest. There's a package of software we use called Uniform. I think I described the performance management software that we would expect to develop in parallel with that. That's called Enterprise, and that is a very effective reporting tool used in our development management service, which allows us to see how the work is flowing through the process and see bottlenecks or issues quite early on. So I would hope that we get ahead in terms of the audit circumstance, but I welcome that as an opportunity to confirm that things are running in a smooth way. But it's, from my point of view, a work in progress at this point in time.
Thank you. Councillor Muller.
I too would like to say what an excellent document the actual Joint Local Planning Enforcement Plan is. And as Vice Chair of the Stowmarket Town Council Planning Committee, I wonder whether it would be useful if we could perhaps have copies of this document or even perhaps a short training session arranged for the, I don't know whether my colleague Councillor Scarf, who also sits on that committee, would agree with me. We've got quite a few new members on that committee who obviously don't sit on planning at district or are not district councillors, and I think this could be a short session on this could be very beneficial to them and all of us generally, actually, if that could be arranged.
Councillor McCraw.
On that very point, Chair, I'd just like to add, when I was referring to this earlier, that we should add an extra recommendation. We might be early for that, but this seems an appropriate point to add it, because I think it's not just useful for parishes and towns. I honestly believe this is the best collection of this information, and I'm sure it was available before, but I didn't know where to look. I do now, and this report's been really useful. I think this will be used to every member. So I would add recommendation 3.4, that we should make members aware of this report and provide a link to it on our website. Regardless of the fact that it may be superseded by a later document that would help inform those people who might be serving on the working group in 3.2. So I think 3.4 is a valid suggestion.
Cool. Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I absolutely agree with Councillor McCraw on this one. And I'd just like to say that it has answered a lot of questions that I could have asked today. Thank you.
Thank you. Phil, you wanted to have a few words?
Chairman, if I may, by good fortune, you and I will be meeting sometime after this one to discuss the very matter of parish and council and town council training, which I think is an opportunity we can pick up that conversation. From my perspective, we, as officers, have started a conversation with Suffolk Association of Local Councils about parish training. That's not concluded yet, and we may choose to do something different around this. I certainly think that planning training is part of this, and enforcement is a matter that it will be useful to train on. I think with 200 or so parishes to do that, one must measure one's cloth, and I want enforcement officers investigating cases. So we would need to structure and plan that, but I see no reason why we wouldn't explore that as a part of planning training. And you know, the only point I'd make is that the current plan I foresee will need to change into a new plan, and I'd rather manage my expectations around training on that, because the plan is the benchmark of what to expect in standard terms, but there's certainly a lot of information about how the process works, which I think parishes should be aware of and made aware of, and if they know there's a plan and that the plan's going to change, then they can at least look at it and be fed it as where we go.
Thank you. Are we ready to move on to debate and consider recommendations? We've got 3 recommendations. Obviously, the contents of the report will be noted. The second is to recommend to Cabinet the establishment of a member officer task and finish working group, I think is recommended, to review the plan, and that this group be requested to have regard to best practice and other examples of other published local enforcement plans in that process of review. We've got 3.3, which is an update on progress with service transformation work within the planning enforcement service, to be provided back to this committee. And 3.4 was to make members... Did you have a precise
I had a wording as make members aware of the report and provide a link to it on our website, just as purely as a piece of information and understanding, because, I mean, effectively, we are the ones who are going to be answering in our communities when people generally raise these objections and these concerns. And as Simon has pointed out, yes, sometimes there is nothing to them. It's just a matter of understanding and interpretation. Often the understanding is that such work doesn't have to take place immediately, and it can take place at any point in a lengthy time frame. But members having this level of understanding, I think, would help members in doing that part of the job.
We're moving towards recommendations, but I think Emily would like to have a few words before we make any mistakes in our recommendation.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, just to clarify that 3.2 would actually have to be a recommendation to Council, with planning being a Council function rather than an executive function. So the working group it follows then should be formed from the whole Council rather than just restricted to the Cabinet.
Thank you, Emily. With that, are you happy to propose... Oh, sorry.
Chairman, just one thing. I mean, the 3.3 does not include a time frame, and I'm very happy that it's open-ended, but would it be useful to consider a 6-month time frame and therefore look to August as a point in time where I come back to you and report on progress?
Assuming we can accommodate that in our work programme, I don't see why not.
Well, that would be a good starting point if we aim towards August, and if it does fit in better in September or whatever. So with all of those... Yeah.
For recommendations, adding 6 months and changing it to council, and adding the words task and finish working group. Yes.
Your 3.4.
Okay, right, sorry, excuse me.
Right.
Sorry, we can either have a task and finish group or a working group. A task and finish group do not need any approval from council or cabinet, whereas working group would need to go to council to be agreed.
I believe it should be working group then, because that's the process by which we've been operating in other areas. Sorry. That's where we've been doing in other areas. We're doing working groups across various policy initiatives.
It was originally framed as a member working group. It was reframed as a task and finish group on the basis that this is about the reworking of the enforcement plan, which is a start and finish activity, and that was why we were describing a task and finish group, because it comes together, meets a few times, gets the plan in place and finishes.
So do we remove the word council, Chair? Because that doesn't report to council, does it? Task and finish. I think you said, Henriette, it doesn't report to council.
The task and finish group can report to council, but it doesn't need to be agreed to be established by the council.
So we can recommend the establishment of. Are you happy with that? Yeah? So 3.2 is to recommend the establishment of a member officer task and finish group without the word working to review and so on. And 3.3 we've added on to the end, provided back to committee in August 2020 in 6 months. Councillor Scarf.
Chair, a little uncertain about the task and finish group. Would it be then a task and finish group of this committee, or would it be a task and finish group of the council? So how would we make, or how would they make appointments?
Chair, if I can give a couple of options to the committee. You could have an overview and scrutiny task and finish group, which would be members from this committee, and then you could choose to co-opt other people on. So, for example, the chairs of the planning committee might be a sensible option. Or you could just recommend that the council as a whole creates a task and finish group. Remember, this is member and officer, so actually officers would just go away and through group leaders ask for volunteers to come onto the group. So you've got two options really as to how much control the committee wants to retain over that task and finish group.
Are you happy with option B? Option B. So we don't need to control this. So no. So the wording as it now stands in 3.2 is okay. Yeah. So we've got a proposal. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Muller. And are we all in favour, please? Yes, we are all in favour. Thank you very much. Big thank you to the officers. We've had, I think, a really good to and fro on questions and answers. I think it's been really helpful. It's been very informative for me, and I'm sure for all members of the committee. Thank you very much indeed. It was McCraw who proposed, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. We move on to item 9, which would be an information bulletin if we have one, but there are no information bulletins this month. Item 10 is the forthcoming decisions list. Members have had an opportunity to look through this. I couldn't see anything there that would require us to carry out any scrutiny. So are you happy that we move then on to item 11, which is the Babergh Overview and Scrutiny Work Plan? Councillor McCraw, are you happy with it? Anything you...
Yes, Chair, I'm happy with it. I think we're pretty much ready for the rest of this year, allowing for small changes that might take place. But we can deal with those in the Chair's meetings if you and the Vice Chairs are happy with that idea. Adrian? Yes, you're happy with that, Pracice. We can deal with that. I think there's enough on our work plan that doesn't mean we're overloaded.
And I think, generally speaking, the Mid-Suffolk Overview and Scrutiny Work Plan mirrors the Babergh. There's 1 or 2 items which are specific to Babergh, others which are specific to Mid-Suffolk. So are we happy to note we carry on with the both work plans as they presently stand? Thank you. Councillor McCraw.
Was one item that I believe we were discussing regarding some development of the future work plans. I believe the monitoring officer had some suggestions in that direction, and I was wondering if that might be would work well as being folded in with the review of overview and scrutiny that both the joint committee will be undertaking in May. There would seem to be a sort of natural synergy that if we review our previous year and look forward to the next year at the same time, we'll be doing that anyway. Would that fit with your plans, Emily?
The only issue around that is that the Overview and Scrutiny Committee submits their work plans to annual council, I believe, for approval. So you might need to do it before then. I don't think there's anything constitutionally that necessarily requires it to go to annual council, but it's just our custom and practice.
In that case, we'll follow our usual custom and practice, and we'll have it ready by then. I'm sure we can manage that in chairs, and we can add it to the agenda for general discussion. Adrian?
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair, and it's related to Alistair's work plans here. The Bellevue House on the 18th of May.
Yes.
Are we sure that we'll have sufficient arrangements there for Bellevue House, because it's still undergoing applications of the house?
From what I understand in informal discussions with Emily Attack, if it isn't ready, we may have to delay that, but we can put it into the work programme at the appropriate time. There's no point in doing it. It's already been held back. But I think Councillor Grandon may have some more knowledge on that. Oh, I was hoping you did have some more knowledge on that, sorry.
Councillor Grandon.
I noticed that on the Mid-Suffolk Scrutiny Committee, there's something that I think, unless I've missed it, should be a joint one, which is reviewing civil parking enforcement. And I haven't noticed it as a joint matter, or have I missed it?
We decided that we'd already reviewed the joint working plan, and that was the Babergh, myself and Adrian. We didn't feel that we needed to do so, as we think we'd already done it. And since the item's just been withdrawn from Cabinet because certain decisions haven't been made elsewhere that affect our own adoption of planning enforcement, I regard it as something of a moot point. I did notice it myself, but I honestly, there was no appetite from the Babergh members, well, as represented by Adrian and myself, to do so. Now, if you tell me that the Babergh members do have such an appetite, happy to continue, put it back on, but at the moment, I'm not sure I see a point. But we did examine the joint parking plan and the toolkit available. Now, until civil parking enforcement is actually in place, what is it we're scrutinising? I mean, it's been held up again because I believe that Suffolk County Council have not provided full information for our Cabinet to be able to make a decision. And without that information, they can't make a decision. And then, from my point of view, I don't see that we have anything to scrutinise until a decision has been made.
I think possibly the difference was that at Council, at Mid-Suffolk, there were a lot more queries and unknowns and debate on the introduction of civil parking enforcement than possibly there were at the Babergh Council meeting. So it was as a reaction to that, really, that it was put into the Mid-Suffolk work plan. But because we had looked at the overall parking plan previously, not the plan for civil enforcement, but the parking plan, I think Babergh probably felt that there was enough in that parking plan which had been agreed to cover the eventualities of civil enforcement. On the other hand, Mid-Suffolk councillors did not think the same, and that's why it's in the Mid-Suffolk plan. I mean, it would be quite easy if things change in the next month or so to put it in as a joint item rather than as a Mid-Suffolk only item. But I think there didn't seem to be the same need from Babergh as there was from Mid-Suffolk.
If I could clarify the Babergh position as I see it, is that we have a toolkit, but as yet we have yet to decide which bits of the toolkit we would use in which places. So I don't see that we can really we've already scrutinised the toolkit, and we've accepted that the toolkit is a fit and proper document with a variety of different methods that could be used in different areas. But without decisions being made, we have nothing to scrutinise until that decision is made.
If it's being, is it still being implemented on the 6th of April?
Your guess is as good as mine. It was due to come to Cabinet this month, and it was withdrawn at the last minute from Cabinet. So I would have to take advice from officers and from the Cabinet as to where they see it now. But the Cabinet didn't feel that they had the information on which to make any decisions, so they weren't going to make any decisions. Is that a fair reading of the situation?
The situation is that Mid-Suffolk Cabinet have adopted the joint parking plan and Babergh Cabinet haven't. So that needs to go back to Babergh Cabinet to be revisited. But the fact of the matter is that civil parking enforcement is going to come in and has got to be implemented in some way. Exactly. Well, it's nationwide, so that's got to be implemented in some way by the given date.
We just don't know what the details of it are and what policies will be used where.
So if it's going to be implemented, as it sounds like it will have to be, should we not, once it's been enforced for about 3 months, be looking at how it... So should we not put it into our plan for maybe June, July committee?
I don't think 3 months is going to give you significant amounts of data. I would suggest 6 months might be better as a minimum, and it could even be that before you actually get any useful... I mean, that's been a principle we've adopted in the past, is that we don't try and measure on a very small sample. We try to use as large a sample as we possibly can, preferably a year, because, yeah, but I would accept 6 months. And in fact, since our current work plan has got enough on it, 6 months would be more appropriate. But I mean, that 6 months could be 7, it could be 8, it could be something like that. But you do need to have the data. And bear in mind, you'll have a delay in collecting that data. So to get 6 months worth of data will probably take 8 months or 9 months, if you follow me.
My concern would be that if there are any worries about its implementation in practice, that things get ironed out quite quickly rather than because of processes being a slow thing, that rather, that we nip things in the bud, if you like, rather than allow things to take hold too quickly. We're able to report back any issues sooner rather than later.
I think there are some problems with that, in a sense, because we are talking about two separate other authorities actually carrying out our parking provision at Babergh. Bury St Edmunds and West Suffolk will supply for the west of the district, and Ipswich will supply for the east of the district. And without a steer from Cabinet, I mean, I think it's just a bit nebulous at the moment to make decisions. We can keep it in mind as a principle, but I don't think we can make a decision without an information base on which to make that decision. So I would leave it at the moment, and but then it doesn't mean we can't come back to it at any time. I mean, we can probably get something on an agenda with about a month or two's notice. Wouldn't that be fair to say, Henriette?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Alistair, if I could just say this. There were a number of issues at Council that had not been resolved prior to the implementation. And this, the purpose of the scrutiny on the 23rd of March is to have an information bulletin updating on the points that were still uncertain when it was debated at Council. It's not a review of how well it's working. Is everything set up, ready for a start in April, and do we know what it's going to cost, how it's going to be done, and so on? Because there were a number of things which were not understood. But I think Emily would like a word, and then we'll come to Dave Muller.
Chair, if it's useful to the committee, I actually think this would be a very interesting topic for the committee to take forward, a post-implementation review. That kind of scrutiny is actually one of the key functions of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. So I think it has merit in taking it forward. I think probably, as Councillor McCraw has alluded to, actually just leaving it as a item in the bottom part of your work plan to begin with, rather than scheduling it for an exact date, might be sensible, so you can see how the picture starts to emerge. But what I would say is that you need to be very clear about what your measure of success would be. So if you're going to look at how successfully the plan has been implemented, you need to be very clear on what kind of measures and therefore what data you want. And actually agreeing some of that, perhaps in Chair's briefing, would be useful so officers can start to collect it from the outset.
I think that's very good advice. So perhaps we ought to do a bit of scoping at the next chairs and vice chairs meeting, so that we can set the parameters as Emily said. So are you all happy with that?
Yes.
So that doesn't mean a change.
I would like to wait for too many things to go wrong. Because the whole process will be a lengthy one. So I would like to, for what we do to be useful, and to be seen to be nipping things in the bud early rather than waiting a year down the line.
I'd have to say that on that subject, I'd expect Sudbury and Hadley members in particular to take an interest in this matter.
I'm sure that will be the case.
And Stowmarket members, and I think members in rural areas as well, who are wanting to get something out of this. Councillor Muller.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm very keen for certainly the Mid-Suffolk Overview and Scrutiny Committee to include this on our March programme, because even yesterday I've had questions from Cedars Park Residents Association exactly what's going to happen with parking enforcement. So I would actually benefit, I think, from be able to speak to them, like what can you do, what can't you do, so that I can then report back to them. That was certainly very...
Yes, it is a seeking of information rather than a debate that we're looking for in March. And by all means, come along. Right, can we now move on? We're now to the point where we need to discuss excluding the public. So, yeah. So before everybody needs to be here for the decision on whether or not to exclude the public. You can't go yet, Babergh members. We need to consider whether, pursuant to Part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972, the public be excluded from the meeting for the business specified below, on the grounds that if the public were present during this item, it's likely there would be the disclosure to them of exempt information as indicated against the item. So can I have a proposer?
A point of order, Mr. Chair. Is it appropriate for the Babergh members to be voting on this? We have no knowledge and no interest directly in it.
As this is a joint committee, we're going to have to exclude you, and we're all going to have to do that jointly, so that the Mid-Suffolk members can vote on the Mid-Suffolk minutes, if you see what I mean.
I just think it's a bit weird that we're going to be voting to exclude ourselves.
As Henriette's described, because it is a joint committee, you do have that option, because of course you could vote not to exclude yourselves. So.
Could we abstain? Would that be a sensible solution?
Do it, Alistair. By the time you've just...
Well, it is a joint meeting up to and including this point.
Councillor McCraw, as you might recall, we've previously had issues with minutes that has been taken from a separate or a singular committee, lasting 6 months before they came back to a singular committee, and members were complaining about that they couldn't actually remember what was going on, so they couldn't actually remember what was supposed to be in the minutes. And therefore it was decided, I think sometime last year, that we should take the individual minutes to the joint meetings as soon as possible so that they could be signed off by the appropriate committee.
Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As much as I enjoy being with the Mid-Suffolk Group on a joint meeting, I've got no problems, but I would like to propose that we actually leave, the Babergh members do leave the meeting, so
and exclude
you guys can sort yourselves out.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'd second that motion.
Thank you. And is everyone in favour? Everyone is in favour. Thank you very much.